Emma interrupted her father's wedding at the most critical moment, accusing his bride of racist schemes that destroyed the lives of black entrepreneurs. The guests froze in shock, and her father, a successful and privileged white businessman, was faced with a terrible truth he had long ignored. Now, with her own family on the verge of falling apart, Emma must decide. Will she stop, or will she fight to the end, despite the danger looming over her? The events that follow will stun even the most seasoned. Emma stood at the entrance to the grand hall where her father David's wedding to his new wife, a white woman named Laura, was about to begin. It was an extravagant reception filled with guests, most of whom Emma didn't know. She felt like an outsider amidst their conversations and laughter. Everyone around her appeared effortlessly happy, but her mind was consumed with one thought: the truth she needed to reveal. David had divorced Emma's mother when she was still young, and since then, their relationship had remained strained. He rarely discussed his personal life with her, and Emma barely knew Laura, despite having seen her at a few family gatherings. But recently, Emma had discovered something that could destroy everything. Laura was involved in fraudulent schemes that targeted black entrepreneurs. Emma couldn't stay silent. It would be a betrayal of her conscience and her people. As the ceremony began, Emma stood at the very back of the hall, watching her father and Laura prepare to marry. She saw the way her father smiled at his bride, and bitterness welled up inside her. He had always seemed blind to issues of racial injustice, and Laura, at first glance, embodied everything he valued. Successful, privileged, a white woman. Emma knew she was standing on the verge of making the most important decision of her life. Her heart raced with every step closer to the altar. Just as David and Laura were about to exchange vows, Emma couldn't hold back any longer and called out loudly, "Father, you can't marry her. You need to know the truth." The entire hall fell silent. Guests turned to Emma in shock, and David looked at his daughter with confusion and disbelief. Laura immediately stiffened, her smile vanishing. David stepped forward, trying to grasp what was happening. "Emma, what are you doing?" he asked, his voice filled with confusion and puzzlement. Emma met his gaze, feeling the tension in the room rise. "You need to know who she really is," Emma said, her voice resolute despite the fear of how her father and the gathered guests would react. Laura tried to maintain her composure, but her face had gone pale. Emma didn't stop. "She's involved in fraud. Her business is built on exploiting black entrepreneurs. She deliberately destroys them to enrich herself at their expense." The silence in the hall became almost unbearable. David stood frozen in place, visibly bewildered, looking from Emma to Laura, unable to believe what he had just heard. "What are you talking about, Emma?" he asked, hoping this was all a misunderstanding or mistake. Laura quickly stepped forward, taking his hand, her face tense but still attempting to maintain her composure. "Darling, don't listen to her. She's just jealous," Laura said, though a hint of nervousness crept into her voice. But Emma was resolute. She pulled out a folder containing the documents she had gathered over the past few weeks and handed them to her father. "Here's the proof. Laura has been using her position to exploit black business owners. She promises them financial help and then hikes up interest rates, knowing they won't be able to repay. Their businesses collapse, and she seizes their assets." Emma's heart clenched as she spoke. She knew she was ruining her father's day, but staying silent would have been a betrayal. The guests began to whisper among themselves. The white guests glanced at Emma with confusion and judgment, some with irritation. What was supposed to be a joyful occasion was unraveling into a scandal. Sensing the growing pressure, Laura switched to a defensive stance. She stepped forward, her face contorted with anger. "This is a lie. She's just trying to ruin our day. You're jealous, Emma, because your father has finally found happiness." David, still in shock, began flipping through the documents. His expression shifted from confusion to doubt, and then to fury. He couldn't believe the woman he was about to marry could be involved in something so unscrupulous. "Laura, what is this? Is this true?" His voice trembled, but there was an unmistakable command in it. Laura was at a loss for words. Her initial confidence faltered as David started reading the documents aloud. You used your company to destroy the businesses of people who couldn't afford legal protection? David continued, each word eroding the trust he had placed in the woman he thought would become his wife. Emma watched her father closely. She saw him grappling with this new information, as his world seemed to crumble before him. The guests around them continued to observe the unfolding drama, some even pulling out their phones to record the scene. While many of the white guests looked at Emma with disapproval, there were those whose expressions began to shift, doubt creeping in about Laura's integrity. Realizing her deceit was coming to light, Laura went on the offensive. It was just a business mistake. I never meant to hurt anyone. It's an old issue. It has nothing to do with our wedding, David. But her voice wavered, and the tension in the room only mounted. Emma felt the pressure intensify, but she knew she had done the right thing. She couldn't let her father marry a woman whose actions had caused suffering in her community. David stood with the documents in hand, his face twisted in a mix of anger and pain. Just moments ago, he had been a joyful groom, but now everything he believed in was crumbling. He looked at Laura again, but this time with suspicion, which quickly grew into outright mistrust. How could you? I thought you were a different person, he said, his voice filled with disappointment. Sensing her grip on the situation slipping, Laura made a desperate attempt to regain control. David, that was a long time ago. It was just business. You know that tough decisions have to be made in business. Yes, there were mistakes, but I was trying to help those people. But her words were no longer reaching David, who now looked at her as if she were a complete stranger. Emma, watching the scene unfold, felt the tension rise. She realized that her intervention was not only wrecking the wedding, but also breaking her father's heart. Her internal conflict grew stronger. On one hand, she wanted to protect him, but on the other, she knew the truth had to come out, no matter the pain it would cause. She remembered all the conversations about racism that her father had always avoided. She remembered how he ignored her attempts to discuss what she faced as a black woman in a world dominated by white privilege. And now, finally, he was being forced to confront what he had always tried to overlook. Summoning all her resolve, Emma stepped forward. Father, you've always lived in your own world. You don't know what it's like to be on the other side. You've never seen how people like Laura use their privilege to profit off people like us. You turned a blind eye to what I've been through, and now you're turning a blind eye to the truth about her, she said, her voice calm, but laden with the weight of her pain. David looked at his daughter, his eyes filled with the realization that he had indeed missed much of her life. He tried to speak, but no words came. He had always been surrounded by privilege, and now he was beginning to understand how little he had grasped of his daughter's world. Tears welled up in his eyes. Emma, I didn't know. I never thought Laura could be capable of something like this, he said, his voice trembling with regret. But Laura wasn't ready to give up. She stepped forward, her face contorted with fury. This is all lies! She's just trying to ruin our wedding! David, you have to stop her! She's your daughter! She just can't handle you being happy! Laura's voice grew louder, desperate to reclaim control. Emma felt fear rising inside her, but she was prepared to keep fighting for the truth. She had passed the point of no return. You can't hide this anymore, she said firmly, locking eyes with Laura. Your actions destroyed the lives of my people. You used us for your own gain, and now it's coming out. Realizing that she could no longer manipulate the situation, Laura's tone suddenly shifted to one of cold threat. Her voice turned sharp, dripping with menace. I'm not going to listen to this nonsense any longer. David, if you don't stop her, I will. I'll call the police and have her arrested for slander. Her threat hung in the air, and Emma felt her insides tighten. Emma could already envision how the situation might unfold. She knew all too well how dangerous an encounter with the police could be for a black woman. She remembered her father's warnings about how to behave in such situations to avoid conflict. But she also knew that she couldn't back down. This was her moment of truth, the moment where she had to stand up for what she believed in, despite the fear. David stood between Emma and Laura, torn by conflicting emotions. His love for his daughter and his shattered trust in the woman he had planned to marry warred within him. He now faced a choice that went beyond the wedding. He had to decide what kind of man he was going to be in the face of the truths his daughter had brought to light. David was on the verge of a breakdown. His world was crumbling before his eyes. The truth about Laura was too bitter and destructive, and the daughter he had once failed to understand now stood before him as the voice of truth. He could no longer ignore either her words or her pain. But Laura's threat to call the police was serious, and David knew things could spiral out of control. "Laura, calm down," he tried to say, but her face twisted further with anger. She pulled her phone from her purse and began dialing 911, her voice shaking with fury. "I won't let her ruin our lives. She's just jealous because you're happy with me." Emma stood still, her heart pounding. She knew how badly things could go if the police arrived and saw her as a threat. Throughout her life, she had heard of similar incidents involving black people that ended in tragedy. Despite being right, she understood that the situation could easily spiral out of control, as it so often did in cases like these. Suddenly, one of the guests, a black man in his 40s, stepped forward. He had been a silent observer until now, but he couldn't stand idly by any longer. "Laura, that's enough," he said firmly. "I know you. You worked with my friend, and he suffered from your schemes too. What Emma is saying is true. You've scammed too many people, and it's time for it to stop." This man, one of Laura's victims, spoke with the weight of personal experience, and his words cut through the room like a cold wave. Laura froze. The guests began to murmur louder, exchanging glances. Many eyes were now fixed on Laura, and she could feel her control slipping away for good. She nervously turned away from the crowd, but kept the phone to her ear as the operator from 911 answered. "I'd like to report a disturbance," she started, but her voice was shaky, betraying her growing panic. David, realizing the situation was escalating dangerously, made a decision he couldn't have imagined just moments earlier. "Laura, stop," he said firmly, stepping closer to her. "You've hurt too many people, and I won't let you hurt my daughter." He paused before adding, "If anyone's calling the police, it's going to be me." Laura looked at him in horror, her face contorted with disbelief. David took the phone and dialed 911 himself, but with a different purpose. "I'd like to report a case of fraud," he told the operator. "There's a woman here who's been running scams, targeting black business owners. Please send the police to investigate." Laura stood frozen, finally realizing the game was up. Her face went pale, and she tried to speak, but her words evaporated into the air. In that moment, she understood that she had been fully exposed. Emma stood nearby, still feeling the weight of the tension, but slowly her fear began to fade. Her father had finally made the right choice. His support, even though late, was a crucial step toward healing their relationship. When the police arrived, Laura tried to defend herself, but the evidence gathered by Emma and the affected guests was overwhelming. Laura was taken in for questioning. The guests watched, some in shock, others with a sense that justice had finally been served. Emma and David stood side by side, both silent as the police did their job. David, with sorrow and regret in his eyes, looked at his daughter. "I've been so blind," he said quietly. "I didn't understand what you were going through, or what was happening around me. I'm sorry for that." Emma looked at him, sensing a shift in their relationship. "I just wanted you to see the truth," she replied, her voice gentle but firm. David embraced her, and in that moment, Emma knew that their bond was beginning to heal. He was finally on her side, ready to fight for justice, just as she had been all along.